Welcome back out on the mushroom trail. It's another just beautiful wet fall day, and there's mushrooms just everywhere out here. We're certainly in full swing. Let's jump in. Let's see what we see. So moving just down the trail here, boy, we've got a mushroom that's really out in force right now. This is one of our slime spikes. This one, affectionately known as the Rosy Slime Spike, Gomphidius subroseus. And you'll notice it's got this pinkish, kind of slimy cap, bright yellow base of the stipe there. We can see it looks like this one's been eaten on a little bit, but let's take a look. So notice underneath we've got these decurrent gills. I see a little bit of a partial veil. It's going to have this kind of web-like slimy partial veil and decurrent gills running down the stipe. It's going to leave a little bit of a ring zone there, and we can see a little bit of an indication of the spore color as well. Let's take a look at another one and just see if we can get a better look at some of those key features. If I give this one a tug, we can see this a little further along. There's those black spores that we referenced. Wow, this one also nibbled on by slugs by the look of it. But, you know, these Gomphidius and Crugonphus genus mushrooms that are known as the slime spikes are actually the only mushrooms that you'll find out here that have decurrent gills and black spores. It's also super interesting because we've been learning more and more about their relations to other mushrooms out here in the forest. And moving just a little bit further down, I see some russulas back there, likely the shrimp russula, Russula olympiana, formerly known as Russula Xeromphalina. But I'm most interested in continuing our exploration here of these slime spikes. So I alluded a second ago to, increased knowledge or understanding of the way that these interact with other mushrooms out here. And these have really unique associations. So for one thing, they're more closely related to boletes than they are to other gilled mushrooms. Boy, this young one, a great example here. Let's give this a tug. You can see a slightly yellow base. Look underneath. Boy, that's really kind of characteristic color. And again, it's going to be viscid and it's wet, kind of gel-like. But get this, so these mushrooms actually, we've once believed that they had mycorrhizal associations with conifers, but recently we've been making a lot of breakthroughs and headways and better understanding the way that these mushrooms operate in the forest. And it turns out that they're actually parasitic on the mycelium of slippery jacks in the Suillus genus. And it gets even weirder than that because each of these Gomphidius species or Crugonphus species is going to have a preferred Suillus host. So they're going to be species specific in terms of who they pair with. So this specific one, Gomphidius subroseus, is actually going to pair with our Suillus lakei, which is the western painted jack. And so kind of cool to think that when we see this mushroom here, we know that it's also indicative of the presence of the mycelium, not just of any Suillus species, but of a very specific Suillus species, Suillus lakei. So, and it makes sense, like the Suillus lakei that this associates with is actually has an ectomycorrhizal association with Douglas fir. So it's no wonder why we thought that this mushroom might also have that same association. So really interesting to note. Boy, that's a beautiful look at a mature one. We can see those black spores and the ring zone, decurrent waxy gills. Just beautiful to look at. And moving just up the trail from those slime spikes, take a look at this. We've got a vibrant, bright white mushroom growing up from the forest floor here. Boy, look at that cap. So obviously a little bit of rain on it, but we can also see a little bit of texture, kind of a unique shape, almost a little marshmallow-like. Stipe, a little bit shaggy. Boy, look at this. Let's see if we've got a partial veil down here. It looks like we do, and maybe a little smoother as we get closer to that veil and gill structure. Let's give this a tug. See what we've got down here at the base. Oh, nice. All right, so take a look at this. We've got a bulbous base, lots of mycelial threads hanging off of the base of this. Look at that, really developed. This is definitely an interesting find out here. As we look up here, boy, we see a nice intact partial veil, a little bit webby in towards the stipe. Now this is super fascinating. I believe that what we're looking at is Agaricus sylvicola, which is commonly referred to as the Woodland Almond Agaricus. And, you know, this could easily be confused with a lot of amanitas. Let's take a look underneath here and see what we've got underneath the partial veil. Let's take a look in there. So we've got relatively close gills, close free gills, a little bit of a pinkish coloration too on the stipe as we get up there. And boy, as I give this a little bit of a sniff, it's got a little bit of an almond scent as well. So that's very distinctive of the Agaricus genus. And boy, just up here, let's see what we've got behind this cedar. This looks like it very well may be another pair of these Agaricus sylvicola, or the Woodland Almond Agaricus mushroom. Boy, look at this. We've got a really pronounced skirt under there. You can see that cap has that exact same structure. Now, it's worth mentioning that when I say Agaricus sylvicola, that's a group of mushrooms that, you know, to get this down to species, I'm really not sure. And again, I wouldn't, you know, eagerly bring this home to the table, even though if it is that one, it's edible. But, you know, this can look pretty similar to a lot of those amanitas, you know, like Smith's amanita or the Woodland amanita. This is definitely not a beginner mushroom or one that I would advise anyone looking to forage necessarily. But notice this one is, yeah, it looks like it's lacking that bulbous base. Definitely the same mushroom. We've got a little bit of mycelial threads coming off of there. Again, a little pinkish blush on that stipe and a really pronounced skirt. So it's a little further along than those other ones. But boy, we can see a lot of those hallmark Agaricus characteristics present in this one. So again, I would go with Agaricus sylvicola group, the Woodland Almond Agaricus group, which contains several species flying under the same common and even scientific name oftentimes. But super cool to see this one out here. Let me know your thoughts on this if you've got an opinion on, you know, what this is with any greater degree of specificity. I'd be curious to hear from you. And just up the trail here, boy, we've got a really, really cool mushroom. This, one of our Elfin saddles. And boy, you can sure see how it gets its name. You can imagine an elf riding this little mushroom all over the forest. This one, I believe, the elastic Elfin saddle, Helvella elastica. There are several mushrooms that are kind of similar that are all in this Helvella genus. There's another very similar one, Helvella compressa. But I believe this one, the elastic Elfin saddle, a lot of times when I see this, it'll occur in troops, just like we're seeing right here. So we can see a rather large grouping of these growing trail side. And boy, it's got that real, true characteristic kind of saddle shape to it. The similar one that I referenced, Helvella compressa, looks almost identical to this. One of the key features for that one that I'd be looking for is these fine little felty hairs that are apparent underneath the cap, which I'm not seeing evidence of on this one, but it does share a lot of characteristics with this bright white stipe, kind of a grayish brown or brownish tan cap that's in this saddle shape. Love seeing these guys out here. So take a look up here, just off to the side of the trail, we see what has been a really common sight this fall out here in the Pacific Northwest. This is one of our coral mushrooms. And a lot of times, you know, very often, particularly this year, I've been seeing this all over the place in massive groups or clusters like this. This is actually a mushroom that, believe it or not, is really closely related to chanterelles and hedgehogs. This is our white coral fungus, which is Clavulina coralloides. So this is actually a group that is, there are many species in here, none of which are named out here in the West. So that Clavulina coralloides group refers to, European taxonomy. This is still very much getting worked out through DNA sequencing. But these are actually edible mushrooms that a lot of times, are overlooked by a lot of foragers. And, we've referenced in the past how, specifically yellow fall corals are ones that I'll take a hard pass on because there's plenty of those that'll cause GI upset. But this is actually one that sometimes certain foragers will seek this out, and because it's overlooked by so many other foragers, it's oftentimes out there in abundance, and a lot of people really like the flavor and the texture of this one. Now, one thing that I'll often also mention here, you can see on these ones down at the base, we've got this darkening, kind of graying. This will turn like a black to bluish gray hue. This is actually a parasitic ascomycete that attacks these white corals out here in the Pacific Northwest. So even though the white coral mushroom is edible, it's ill-advised to forage this if you see a lot of this parasitic ascomycete on here. But this is one that's very common out here in the Pacific Northwest this time of year. And boy, it's just a beautiful, beautiful mushroom. It's one that no matter how often I see it, I always like to stop to observe it. And it's got a really kind of unique or interesting personality with its kind of wispy growth structure. And surely many species kind of lumped in under this same common name. And interesting again to see that interplay between several different species of mushrooms kind of interacting. One, an ascomycete that's acting parasitically on it. So interesting to observe. If you see these out here, take some time, spend a little time with these and just kind of get to know them. They've got really unique personality, and you'll see all different kind of statures and characteristics. Boy, look at this guy. This one has quite the personality. Look at that. Isn't that amazing? Cool to see. And just up here on the side of the trail, hiding behind this sword fern, we've got what I think is a very underrated bolete. This is one of our suede boletes in the Xerocomellus genus. In the not too distant past, I would have referred to this as the Zeller's bolete, Xerocomellus zelleri, but recent DNA analysis and sequencing has told us that this is actually a different species that's now commonly referred to as the deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus atropurpureus. You can see this one's got a little bit of rain on it, so it's difficult to see that cap texture, but we see we've got a yellowish sponge layer, red stipe. That cap is going to have a somewhat bumpy kind of texture or surface, but again, because that's wet, I don't know if you can actually detect or see that very clearly, but it's got a somewhat bumpy texture up on the cap. This is a great edible mushroom that's got a little bit of a lemon zest flavor to it. So if you haven't tried this one, I would recommend, if you see these fresh and you haven't tried them, give them a try. I think a lot of people are missing out when it comes to the deep purple bolete. And just up here, growing from well-decayed conifer wood, we've got a really common site up here. This is what's known as the Pinewood Gingertail or the fuzzyfoot, Xeromphalina campanella. Notice this has a beautiful kind of golden brown striate cap that's down curved at the margin, umbonate at the center, and we've got these deeply decurrent gills and this really dark stipe down at the base. So notice that where those gills are, it's that lighter color, but as you go further down the stipe, it's very dark. This one, there are several Xeromphalina species that are all kind of oftentimes described under the same name, but they'll grow in these massive troops on old decaying conifer wood here in the Pacific Northwest. Very cool to see. So check this out, tucked away just off the trail here, growing from well decomposed wood, we've got a mushroom that I've been seeing a lot of this season. This is the honey mushroom in the Armillaria genus. We talked about this at length in last week's video, so I won't go into a lot of details here, but we notice it's got this kind of shaggy, fibril covered cap, pronounced annulus or ring. And you know, this is one that loves rainfall, and I don't know if it's the abundance of rain that we've gotten this season, or if it's other conditions that we may not be tuned into that are just right for this one. But I see it popping up in places that I don't routinely encounter this one. And I know a viewer of last week's video commented that he had never encountered this one in his local forest out on, I believe it's Vancouver Island is where he's located. But he referenced that he just encountered this for the first time. So something about this particular mushroom season is treating the honey mushroom especially well. And it'll kind of go in fits and starts, but this is one of those years where it's just fruiting en masse. And you know, of course, as we referenced last week, this is one of our edible mushrooms. A lot of people regard this as a choice edible, but again, it's edible with caution. So this one does cause some people a little bit of GI upset. So if you've never foraged this one and you're finding it for the first time, I would recommend, as is the case with most wild mushrooms, proceeding with caution and just starting with a relatively small sample, see how it treats you, and then go from there. Because, you know, it's just, you never know, and you want to ease into things like that, especially if a mushroom's got a history of giving some people problems. But that banana slug down there seems to be liking this one, and always a pleasure bumping into the honey mushroom. And just up here growing on the side of the trail, check this out. So we've got one of our boletes, specifically one of our slippery jacks in the Suillus genus. This is one we talked about last episode. This is known by the common name fat jack. This is Suillus carolensis. And even though a lot of these slippery jacks can be somewhat difficult to ID in their youngest stages, there's one thing nearby that's a dead giveaway. So you know how earlier we talked about the Rosy Slime Spike, subroseus. This is a different species of slime spike growing right next to this slippery jack. So this is what's known as the blackening slime spike, Gomphidius organensis. And notice how it's got this white flesh with these black spots forming, again, decurrent gills, dark black spores. This is actually one that, you know, parasitizes the mycelium of this Suillus carolensis. And a lot of times these will fruit at the exact same time, which is really, really interesting. It can be a cool way to ID these. And as time goes on, this slime spike is actually going to just kind of turn into this gooey black mess of a mushroom. Now, notice we've got our fat jack here. This is one of the better Suillus edibles. So it's got a firm texture at this young age. So it's one that sometimes people seek out as an edible mushroom. And here's yet another blackening slime spike that's a little further along. And you know, we mentioned that the slippery jack, so that fat jack, is an edible that's sometimes sought out. Believe it or not, this is actually edible too. And it's oftentimes prepared in a similar way, but I would caution you, this one is known to accumulate heavy metals, so it's not one that I partake in. I don't know many people who do. It just doesn't look that appealing. Look what we've got over here. So we've got another Elfin saddle in the Helvella genus. This one, all white. Boy, look at that stipe. Isn't that amazing? So these are known for that convoluted kind of brain shape cap. And boy, just a beautiful kind of hollowed stipe as well. This is always one that's fun to admire out here. So it's interesting. So sometimes you'll see them with a black cap, Helvella vespertina. Other times you'll see them with a lighter, or even in this case, white cap. We see some younger ones down here where we've got a little darker color. And boy, look at this. So we've got some of these blackening slime spikes, Gomphidius organensis, that are really far along. Man, oh man, look at this mess. You can see how rainwater is pooling up there in the cap, and we've got just this overall blackening, slimy mess. It's funny because, like I said, you know, even though this is edible, I've never partaken. I'd actually be curious to hear from you if you have. I know Daniel Winkler writes about that in his book of, I think he recommends peeling that slimy outer layer, and specifically doing it with ones that are a lot younger than this, and cooking them up or preparing them in a way similar to Suillus. But we see that yellow base still showing up there and those dark spores. This one turning into quite the mess, but also a really cool and beautiful mushroom in its own respect. So I've now wandered off onto a trail where, you know, there really doesn't seem to be much in the way of human foot traffic. In fact, I'm seeing more deer tracks than I am human tracks, which is oftentimes a pretty good sign of a spot that I like to spend time searching for mushrooms. And, you know, just perusing this trail, I gotta say, I'm seeing so many mushrooms that it really is a challenge, kind of picking and choosing which ones to pause and to discuss and talk about, and which ones to pass by. But I know in the most recent episode, we talked about the candy cap mushroom, Lactarius rubidus, at length. And this is one that is a common look-alike for that mushroom. So I alluded to the simple fact that there are so many Lactarius genus milk caps that have this orange color, hollow stipe. Oftentimes they'll, you know, have a lot of the same characteristics, being that, namely, they'll exude a milky latex. But you'll recall that we talked about how with the candy cap, we're really looking for a latex or milk that's the same consistency of, say, skim milk. You can see on this one, hollow stipe, as I mark that with my nail, I'm not seeing actually too much lactation or latex milky substance being exuded there. It may just be the cold nights that we've been getting, or maybe this is far enough along, or maybe it's just a species that doesn't lactate as much as some of the others. But you can see it's got this slimy cap that lacks that distinct texture that we discussed, kind of like orange peel structure, or I should say texture, of the candy cap. So, you know, I alluded to this last time, but you know, you're very likely to encounter a lot of these types of milk caps before you maybe happen upon the candy cap. For whatever reason, the candy cap just seems to be a little less common, so it can take a little bit more effort to track that one down, but you're likely to see those others in abundance. And so keep your eyes out for those, because boy, the candy cap this time of year, such an awesome mushroom. So, but ooh, look at this. So this is a welcome sight, and look at this, right on the trail. If you ever want a good indication of the lack of a presence of other mushroom hunters, it's stumbling across chanterelles right on this trail. This is a really good sign that I'm in relatively infrequently traveled territory here. We've got a nice cluster of Pacific golden chanterelles, Cantharellus formosus. We can see a few of them. Oftentimes these will grow in pairs, but I usually don't see triplets. So that's kind of a unique sight. And boy, I'll tell you, if I'm walking a trail and I happen across Pacific golden chanterelles either just off the trail or right on the trail, that'll usually give me pause and cause me to look slightly off trail to see what I see. So let's take a look. Okay, so here we are. Boy, just beautiful little patch of forest, primarily Doug firs and hemlocks and Nice mature forest. We've got another deep purple bolete, Xerocomellus atropurpureus. Ooh, this one's seen better days. I think I'm going to throw that one back from where it came. Looks like a rustler of some sort there. So that's interesting to see, and boy, certainly a mature forest. Let's take a look over here, something catching my eye. One that we actually haven't discussed or talked about recently. So I believe that this is the Yellowfoot Dapperling. This is actually related to the Lepiotas. Look at that shaggy, kind of scruffy stipe and a little frilly margin. Darker kind of umbo there in the center. A little bit of a partial veil left over. Very good looking mushroom. Cool to see. And again, I believe that that's the Yellowfoot Dapperling. We see a little mycelium off of there too. Very cool to see. Not one I'm interested in foraging or checking out in that respect, but very cool to encounter. And sure enough, as I look around and, under closer inspection, I'm finding this area is just full of Pacific golden chanterelles. And, this has been the most incredible chanterelle year that I can remember. I keep wondering how long it's going to last, because last year, even though the actual crop was significantly less, so we weren't getting as big of flushes, I was still harvesting Pacific golden chanterelles clear through to January. I think that was the longest season that I had ever encountered, just because the temperatures were so mild. This year, we're getting just an incredible flush. And those temperatures have started to drop a little bit, but not so much so that it's starting to, end this incredible run that we've been having for chanterelles. So as long as it stays warm enough, I don't see any reason why it's going to stop. And just a quick review when it comes to the Pacific golden chanterelles. So, we're looking in forests where we know that there are trees that it associates with. So these will form mycorrhizal associations with a lot of our trees that are dominant out here in the Pacific Northwest, namely the Douglas fir, the western hemlock, and spruce. So all three of those trees are really good tree hosts to look for if you're seeking out this particular mushroom. And these flushes have been so significant this year that I keep just kind of thinking, wow, like what a great opportunity to actually find new patches, because a lot of times when these don't fruit in such abundance, it can be relatively difficult to track down the really solid spots. But as I'm sure many of you know, once you come across one of these, you're going to find them in that same spot year after year. So take advantage of this year's incredible flush with the Pacific golden chanterelles to really hunt down some prime patches of chanterelles for future years. And this late in the season, I love finding these smaller ones like this guy, because some of those bigger ones are getting to the point where they're getting rained on enough that they're getting a little waterlogged, a little bit soggy, but these young, kind of firmer fruit bodies are pretty ideal, if you're planning to take it home and cook with it fresh. But either way, it's been wet enough out here that pretty much all of the chanterelles that I'm harvesting here, I plan on taking back and doing a dry saute just to kind of get some of that moisture out and to let it do its thing. And then I'll add my fat. Normally I use olive oil, or sometimes I'll use butter, but usually olive oil. And I'll add that once, they've dry sauteed for a little while and release some of those juices. That'll really concentrate the flavor and give you a nice result. But boy, it is just astounding how many are still out here. So here we are in November, still finding huge flushes of chanterelles, and I have to wonder, are we going straight through the new year just like last year? That would certainly be welcomed. And it's funny, because when I set out today, I didn't necessarily intend to forage a ton of chanterelles or anything, but boy, It's long been one of my favorite wild edible mushrooms, and when you're stumbling across so many that look so prime, it's hard not to add them to the basket. So you know what I'll be eating tonight, and there seems to be no shortage out here. And one of the things that's always super nice about these Pacific golden chanterelles is not only are they super resistant to bugs and other pests that kind of haunt other great edibles like the porcini. Those don't hold up as well, but these can be out here for, a couple weeks and still do great. And then on the flip side of that, too, once we harvest these, they hold up pretty well in the fridge, too. So they've got a long shelf life, which makes them especially good, when they're out here in abundance. It makes sense to stock up while you can. And all of that said, I've got to admit I'm leaving a lot more than I'm taking out here today, and being pretty selective about which ones I add to my basket. If it looks like they're going to require an extra effort to kind of clean off or anything, pretty much leaving any that are buried extensively in duff or anything like that. But still tough to resist, and such a joy coming across these all season long. And it's interesting because oftentimes we don't hear that much about the health benefits that come from these wild mycorrhizal mushrooms that aren't able to be cultivated. There's far fewer clinical trials to look at or explore the health benefits, but it's important to remember that these are packed full of prebiotic fiber that just does wonders to support our microbiome. And it's a very high quality source of protein and B vitamins like B12, as well as vitamins A, vitamin D. This one is high also in trace minerals, things like copper, zinc, iron, all of these things. So it's an excellent thing to be adding to our diet and does wonders for our nutrition, even though you may not hear a lot about it in terms of, clinical trials and things like that. Don't forget that these things are excellent to add to our diet, and they can serve as both a source of food and medicine. At least that's the way I view it. And as I was harvesting those Pacific golden chanterelles, look what caught my eye. Isn't this beautiful? This is what's known as the Western Amethyst Deceiver, Lacaria amethysteo-occidentalis. So quite a mouthful on that Latin name, but boy, in its youngest state, this is one of the most beautiful mushrooms that you'll encounter out here in the forest. Isn't that stunning? I know that this is one that we checked in about briefly last week. Even though this is, regarded as being edible in some guides, it's ill-advised to actually forage this for the table for the simple fact that it's known to accumulate heavy metals, but definitely one that's worth spending time with. Just an absolute beauty. And I always love slowing down just to admire everything that's going on these moss-covered logs and down trees. It's always interesting to see. Here we've got an abundance of lichens really doing their thing right next to some Trembling Phlebia, Phlebia tremulosa. This world of lichens is something that is just so fascinating to me. And over the course of the last several years, I've gotten more and more interested in what's going on with them. I'm sure several of you recognize that this represents a symbiotic relationship between fungi and then algae, or sometimes even cyanobacteria. So there's really a lot going on there that isn't necessarily as well understood as a lot of the other organisms that exist out here in the forest. Still so much to learn about lichens and the role that they're playing out here in the forest. Beautiful. And here's a group of really interesting mushrooms just off the trail here. Check these guys out. We've got those two-toned caps. If we look underneath, we've got gills these are going to start out white and turn kind of a dingy tannish color. You can see the base of it down there. But this likely a toxic mushroom. This is in the Hebeloma genus. These are collectively known as the poison pies. This particular one is likely in the Hebeloma mesophaeum group, And we can see how it's got that two-toned, slightly viscid cap. I think that's because it's been getting rained on. But you can see how almost that kind of surface on the cap almost looks like a little pie crust around the edge. Very interesting to see. And take a look at this. So growing off the side of this downed Douglas fir, we've got a pretty good sized mushroom that has this kind of golden yellowish cap and stipe and gills. So all that kind of vibrant color. Now, of course, this is a little wet. Everything looks a little bit different in the rain, but I can see these little fibrils or a little bit of texture up here on the cap. It looks like something's been eaten off of this too. I saw another one that was kind of twisted around. It looked like maybe a squirrel or something was going after it, but fairly large, pronounced stipe here. I believe that what we're looking at is commonly referred to as the decorated mop, or Trichomopsis decora. This is also sometimes called prunes and custard, which is a play on plums and custard, another mushroom that's in the same genus that's really closely related. But really pretty mushroom out here growing off of this down Douglas fir. Definitely catches your eye. Again, pretty good size. It's always interesting to check out these down trees and just to see what's going on in the way of mushrooms. Look at that, picture perfect, right? Let's see if I can get that to focus. Yeah, and again, that defining characteristic is that the gills, the stipe, and the cap are all that golden yellow. Let's take a look over here. So we've got a pretty significantly large troop or group of bonnets. So a lot of times we refer to the bonnets collectively as like one big group. This is the Mycena genus, and these are notorious for being extremely difficult to get down to species, but really pretty. And let's try something. Sometimes these Mycena will really put on a show in UV light. So I've got my 365 nanometer UV flashlight. It's interesting because some of these, so especially the younger ones, seem to really be giving off a nice kind of blue fluorescence, whereas these more mature mushrooms don't seem to be fluorescing in the same way. Let's see if we can find a good one. Here's another youngish Mycena. Oh man, look at that. Isn't that incredible? You can see that blue just really, really vibrant. What a sight. You know, there's so much out here that I often overlook, and every time that I stop and pause, slow down, really take time to admire the little things, there are just whole other universes that tend to open up and reveal themselves, and it really keeps my head spinning and keeps my appreciation for all this stuff that's out here going strong. And boy, as was the case last week, I'm finding that it's tough to put this flashlight away. Isn't that something? If you think you may know the specific species of Mycena that we're looking at here, let me know in the comments. I'd be curious to hear from you. I feel like I could look at this all day. Isn't that something? And check this out. Since I had the flashlight out, I was looking at a different mushroom and caught a glow in the background. Look at this. This thing is so bright that I can't even really capture it. I really have no idea what it is. To me, it looks a little bit like a hygrocebi, but yet another mystery mushroom. So let me know if you've got some thoughts or ideas on what this one could be. And boy, I tell you, I can't get more than a foot or two from where I'm standing without stumbling across another great mushroom. This one of my all-time favorites. This is what's commonly referred to as cat's tongue, or the toothed jelly fungus, Pseudohydnum gelatinosum. And look at this underside. Isn't this incredible? So this translucent, kind of rubbery mushroom, sometimes you'll notice a little dark cap, but it's got distinctive teeth underneath. And that's how it gets its Latin name. Pseudohydnum means false hedgehog. So if any of you have been hunting for hedgehog mushrooms this winter, you'll see a striking resemblance here to this one. And there's really nothing that looks quite like this out here in the forest. Isn't this amazing? And you can tell that that is going to have a texture or feel of a cat's tongue. This is actually an edible mushroom that's edible raw. I'll oftentimes parboil it just to be on the safe side. But you can do a lot of very interesting things with this. I've actually candied this before, so that involves oftentimes soaking it in citrus juices and then slowly dehydrating it to the texture that you prefer. So it really can get to be sort of a gummy candy type texture if you do it right. I've even made sushi with this particular mushroom, which was a wild experiment. But yeah, it's a really cool one. Up in British Columbia, they've got potentially my favorite common name for this. They call it the spirit gummy bear. And you can certainly see why. If you haven't encountered this one, you'll want to check conifer logs. So this is growing on Douglas fir. That's where I tend to see that here in the Pacific Northwest. Now it's worth noting that there are a couple different species of this here locally in the Pacific Northwest. So this is technically a species complex that's based on European taxonomy. We're probably going to get some new names for these guys at some point. But right now, all flying under kind of the traditional European taxonomic name, these guys are shockingly 95% water. And you'll notice that if you do forage these and you take them home and you start to dry them out or dehydrate them, you're going to understand just how much water is contained in there really quickly, because you've got to kind of slice them thick or they'll shrivel up into paper thin little wafers. But one of my all-time favorite mushrooms out here, again, that's the tooth jelly fungus, and it is a gem. And boy, I tell you, everywhere around here, this forest really is just littered with mushrooms. You can see a bunch of those white corals in the Clavulina genus all out there, and boy, there's just so many that I've been passing by here. This really is kind of our peak season as we get into late October, early November, as long as the temperatures stay warm enough. And look what we have down here, no surprises. This is our old friend, the Pacific golden chanterelle. I would only be surprised if we weren't stumbling across more of these, because, you know, as we referenced earlier today, these are just everywhere this year. Now, the really cool thing about coming across them here is that this is a spot that, you know, I didn't really associate with Pacific golden chanterelles, but now that I'm encountering a nice little patch here, and boy, look at that. Beautiful, beautiful flower. But yeah, now that I'm encountering these here, you know, in terms of my mental map of chanterelle patches and places to check up on in years to come, I'm just kind of adding this. And, you know, in less abundant years, it's not necessarily the case that chanterelles won't come up at all. They might just come up in fewer numbers. So when you get a year like this, boy, it really gives you the opportunity to hone in on some fantastic spots to really look more carefully or search more carefully in future years. So definitely excited to be adding these spots to my mental map. And just look at this majestic pair of Pacific golden chanterelles. We referenced earlier when we came across that triplet that, you know, these will oftentimes grow in pairs, and sometimes there's a lot of debate or deliberation over whether to pluck or cut your chanterelles. And even though it doesn't really hurt the mycelium, one thing that is true is if you get a single chanterelle, sometimes it makes sense to cut it because there might be a second one, its twin, still budding out in its primordial state. So this time of year though, no problems plucking at all. And boy, I'll tell you, the more that I look around in here, the more I'm seeing. I've already foraged quite a bit today, so I'm definitely gonna leave more than I'm taking from here, that's for sure. But look at this. So we've got what looks to be kind of another milk cap that's a candy cap look-alike, but back behind that, I'm pretty sure that I'm seeing more gigantic chanterelle flowers in and amongst the sword ferns. Yeah, look at that. Just amazing. So they're having a real bumper year. Again, I can't remember ever finding as many Pacific Goldens as I am this year. In spite of eating so many Pacific Golden chanterelles this fall season, I gotta say I still have not tired of them, so still continuing to forage here and there, but I will say that I'm running low on space. I've only got so much room in the freezer, and that is kind of my go-to method for storing the excess chanterelles that I harvest. I'll typically dry saute those and chuck them into the freezer, which is limited on space. So I'm going to leave these guys out here in the forest and let them do their thing. And just up here, away from those chanterelles, actually on the exact same Doug fir log that we were admiring those toothed jelly fungus mushrooms, we've got one that escaped my attention earlier. This is Hypholoma capnoides, commonly referred to as the conifer tuft or the smoky gilled Hypholoma. So this is actually an edible mushroom that's oftentimes passed on because of the simple fact that it really closely resembles or looks similar to Hypholoma fasciculare. So Hypholoma fasciculare, of course, is the sulfur tuft. That's the one that we featured in UV light. It'll glow this crazy iridescent green. Let me pull out the UV light here. Let's hit this one so that you can see the difference. We'll give it a little shine and you'll be able to see that it's quite different. So if we hit this here, you can see we've got a little bit of a faint glow, but boy, nothing like the sulfur tuft, which glows that neon green. So this can actually be a good way to differentiate those while you're out here in the field. But really beautiful mushroom, often overlooked, and one that you'll find out here fruiting most likely from Douglas fir. And just down here underneath the log, we've got another one of our candy cap lookalikes. This one in the Lactarius genus, Shirley. This is kind of, I would loosely refer to this as just another orange milk cap of sorts. And as I referenced earlier, you know, it can be kind of tricky to get these down to species with certainty. Maybe that's something I'll work on, is tackling that group, but I generally just kind of lump them together. They're either candy caps or they're some other orange milk cap. So this is the latter, and it'll be left behind, but you can see that it's got that kind of wet, somewhat viscid cap, and it's probably not going to lactate in the same way as our candy cap does, but still a beautiful mushroom, fun to see out here. And my goodness, take a look back here. So I'm just a matter of feet from where I was previously, and I just kind of bucked over another downed Douglas fir, and what do you know? A huge patch of Pacific golden chanterelles, Cantharellus formosus. These guys are just occurring en masse this year. Never seen them like this. I think without any exaggeration, I suspect that I've probably left upwards of, I don't know, 100 pounds of these guys right out here in the forest. So these ones are going to be left behind, but you can see just beautiful large flowers of the Pacific golden chanterelle doing their thing and doing it well. Beautiful. And just over here on the other side of this log, we've got one that we featured last week. So this is another massive patch of the candy cap. Look at that. Holy smokes. A little bit of a disturbance in the force here. Wow, a massive limb just came down, a little too close for comfort. Fell onto these hazelnuts that I was about to point out in relation to the candy caps. I think it fell from that massive western hemlock. And boy, the forest seems to be signaling that it may be time to head home. But before we do, just wanted to highlight this guy. This is one that I know a lot of you are after right now. This is the candy cap, Lactarius rubidus. You'll notice it's got this hollow stem, and it'll exude a skim milk consistency latex. And above all else, this is gonna, once dried out, smell of, sweet kind of maple syrup. So usually we don't think of mushrooms for dessert, but this is kind of an anomaly that breaks the rules. So really fascinating mushroom. Keep your eyes peeled out there for this specific one. It's got the texture of an orange peel or newt skin. And boy, they are really popping right now. So if you're here in the Pacific Northwest, keep your eyes peeled for that one. Keep an eye out for hazelnuts. And aside from that, if you're liking these episodes, remember, hit the like button, subscribe, stay tuned, stay safe, and until next time, happy trails.